Hi everyone, this is Counseling 2500, Chapter 2, the Counseling Profession. So what we're going to be covering in this chapter is basically the history, legislation, and facts about the history of psychology and counseling. All right, historical and formative factors. The American Counseling Association, also known as the ACA, defines it as a professional relationship that empowers diverse individuals, families, and groups to accomplish mental health, wellness, education, and career goals. So as you can see from just this definition here, if you become a counselor or go into this field, there's actually a lot of different areas that you can focus in. You don't have to be all about just mental health in the sense of stereotypical someone's depressed, right? But instead, it could be also about being healthy or about education or about actually work. All right, influenced by the generation, the economy, the population movement due to urbanization. So one thing that you also will understand is as we go through the decades, things, politically, economically, whatever it is, trend-wise, pop culture, will influence how people see psychology. There's the vocational guidance movement, the mental health counseling movement, the ongoing development of professional identity, the influence of federal legislation, and then the history of the American Counseling Association, and credentialing, and also the professionalization of counseling. And we'll explore all these as we go along through this chapter. So let's start off with the beginnings of the vocational guidance movement. And in the textbook, they talk about Lysander Richards. In 1881, he wrote a book called Vocophy. It's basically letters in the book came from famous people in the day in different professions. He believed that people should listen to what their successful people had to say about their fields. He believed that women could work if there were no barriers, and he was concerned about youth switching from job to job without consideration of what is best of that specific person and society. And in the 1960s, his ideas emerge as vocational studies. And you can see how, it kind of makes sense and it's kind of logical, right? It's like, let's find out how the people who are most successful got to where they are. Let's interview them. Let's find out exactly what they have to say. Let's find out what kind of personalities they have. It's almost like an advice book from take it from me. I succeeded in this field, so maybe I can help you succeed as well. There's also Frank Parsons. He's interested in social reform and helping people make sound occupational choices. Some called him the first counselor, the father of guidance. Believed it was better to select a vocational scientifically than to drift through a variety of vocations, perhaps never finding one that could be best for the person and make society better. So as you can see right here, along with the other previous person that we talked about, is that they don't want people to just aimlessly try different jobs because it can be very, very tiresome. It could be a big time waster. And that's why we're interested when you guys select your majors that you're actually selecting it for the right reasons, not just because your friends are doing it, so you're going to do it as well, but more of do I think that I might actually be good in this field? And we're hoping that, through the program, you're going to realize yes or no. And then, it's not too late for you to then change your studies to something that's a little bit better. Obviously, there's also cultural considerations in that because maybe your parents or someone else influences you, right? So then that's another factor as well. All right, first person to use the term vocational guidance, and counseling was not designed to make decisions for counselees. So another thing that they want to emphasize is the fact that you, the client or the person, should make those decisions, not the one who is helping you. We're just guiding you, right? But you're the one who makes the ultimate decision because we don't know you. You are your own self. You know yourself better than anyone else. So although we do know you, we don't really know who you are until you tell us, but also what kind of decisions you make. We cannot make those decisions for you. Early ties between vocational guidance and school counseling. It makes sense that guidance counseling would appear and be implemented in the school setting. Jesse B. Davis began advising students about educational and vocational matters. He would have you write essays in English class and also do self-examinations of values and ideas of the selection of a vocation. So he wanted you to write papers about why you're interested in what you're interested in and explain it so that we can all kind of, understand a little bit more about you. Social Darwinism is certain groups in a society become powerful because they have adapted best to the evolving requirements of that society. So if you've ever heard of Darwinism, Darwinism is basically, the fit survive, right? So let's say, for example, there's a lot of animals on an island, and the only main food source is a specific type of nut in a hard shell, right? So anyone where if they cannot figure out how to break that nut to get the food, they're going to die, right? So they've adapted. So these group of people who are successful and are alive and thriving are the ones that were smart enough to figure how. Maybe they can drop the nut really far away from the sky like a bird, and then it breaks and then they can eat it, right? Or maybe they have really strong teeth that are able to crush the hard shell and then are able to eat. So a certain group become powerful or survive while everyone else would die out because they have figured out how to adapt and get the food that they need. Okay. Anna Y. Reid saw it like modern day placement agencies, and Eli Weaver was able to help boys and girls discover what they could do best and how to secure a job in which their abilities could be used to the fullest advantage. There's also the strong interest inventory that emerges in the 1928. And the thing is, the strong interest inventory, or SII, is still used today. If you take the counseling 4480, you might actually be taking that assessment or something very similar to that today, right? And it basically tries to help you define what your interests are, and then from there are a subgroup of jobs that pertain to that specific interest, and then we hope that you would explore it either with a guidance counselor or career counselor, or do it on your own and then figure out what is best for you. Beginnings of mental health counseling movement. In 1800s, there was a woman named Dorothea Dix, and she's actually a really well-known, respected advocate. She was a supporter of the people with disabilities. So she believed in humane treatment of people with emotional disorders in hospitals, but also in psychiatric institutions. So a lot of people tend to treat people very poorly if they have a mental health disability, and unfortunately, it's still going on today, right? People have pity for them, but not necessarily respect or dignity given to that person. So Dorothea Dix is one of those people. Clifford Beers wrote A Mind That Found Itself, which described his experience in severe psychiatric institutions. And you'll see movies about this as well. You probably saw Girl Interrupted, and that was about, a bunch of young ladies back in, I believe, the 60s who were in an institution of some sort. And so you can see the treatment, but we're talking about in the 1800s, which is a lot more severe and probably a lot more painful. In 1908, William Healy established the first community psychiatric clinic, and it was called the Juvenile Psychopathic Institute. It provides services to young people in Chicago, and it used testing, modified psychoanalysis, and involvement of family members. So as you can see, instead of just throwing them into this institution and then letting them kind of just wither away, die away, that they were using testing, they were using psychology, counseling techniques like psychoanalysis, and also having the family members also be part of their person's life. So you can see there's a lot more humane treatment and dignity given to people who had mental health, or whatever situation it was that they were in. In 1909, countrywide child guidance clinics and the U.S. Congress founded the National Committee on Mental Hygiene. So let's talk a little bit about some of the early psychologists. Wilhelm Wundt established the first experimental psychology laboratory in 1870s in Germany using a form of introspection. So that is basically using self-reflection and verbalizing what they were experiencing. So it was kind of like, tell me a little bit about what you're thinking about your life and stuff like that. Okay. William James tried to understand the functions of the mind rather than the structure. He believed in the holistic process, which is considering the thoughts that the person had, how they explained the reasons that they were doing the things that they were doing, how they were feeling, those emotions, and then also why they were doing the things that they were doing. So you can see that he wanted to see all the different aspects of a person's behavior, whether it's in their head or their physicality, and just to see, why did you do the things that you did. G. Stanley Hall, first psychology laboratory in the US in 1883. He collected data on the mental characteristics of children. He's considered the father of American psychology and co-founded the American Psychology Association, also known as the APA, which if you are taking classes in psychology knows that when you write your papers, it's based off of the APA guidelines. Other early contributors are behaviorists John Watson and B.F. Skinner. There's also the experimental psychologist Max Wertheimer and also Wolfgang Kohler. In the 1890s, testing James Cattell focused on measuring intelligence. In the 1905, the Binet-Simon test. 1916, Stanford-Binet test, IQ or intelligence quotients test. So that's probably one of the most famous ones. It originally was called the Binet-Simon test, and then it became the Stanford-Binet test, or the IQ test. And in the illustration, and you see in the slide, is the cover of the IQ test, but also the scale. And the scale goes from genius to very superior to average to dull to borderline deficiency to moron to imbecile and then to idiot. Obviously, we don't use these words anymore in this context of this assessment. However, some of those words you can see are actually now accepted into our vocabulary, right? So when you say, oh, you're such an idiot, it was originally meant to describe people with disabilities, which is why we don't associate those two things anymore. However, a lot of time has passed since then. So when we think of the word idiot, or when you use the word idiot or moron or imbecile, usually you don't even connect it to people with disabilities, right? You're just like, well, that just means you're stupid or dumb, right? And of course, there's also context there. But the word that is very common right now is the word retarded. We do heavily still connect retarded with mental illness. However, a lot of people use it in a way that is, degrading, and it still connects to, let's say, a person with a cognitive disability, which is why it's very sensitive, and that's why we, as professionals in this field, advocate not using the word retarded outside of, or actually rather, we don't use it within the field of disability because it's still seen as a negative. Influences of World War I and the developments of testing. The Army is actually one of the biggest users of intelligence tests or testing. Okay, they have a screen personnel, Army Alpha and Beta IQ tests of intelligence, standardized instrument in the military, educational, and clinical settings. Help develop aptitude and interest tests. So again, because they did it so much, because there are so many people who are drafted into the military or volunteers to go into the military, that we need to know where to place everyone, or at least the military needs to. So there are all these tests, and then they would understand where a person would be placed. Using intelligence, aptitude, achievement, interest, and personality gave a great deal to credibility to a counselor's judgment about a person. So before, it was kind of like, well, this is how I feel about you. But with assessments or testing, then you get, to see the results, and then you're able to really fully, or at least kind of get a better picture of who this person is, right? Counselors were expected to be experts in selecting and using appropriate instruments from a myriad of those offered. So again, there's a lot of testing that exists, and as you get trained and then you go through the courses, you'll learn about very specific tests that are really good to use. Some are not necessarily as, let's say, accessible or user-friendly, or maybe they're just really racist. I'm going to just say that out loud, right? Because in the sense of maybe it wasn't necessarily tested on a diverse group of people. So if a person who is a minority takes it, the results actually are not very accurate because it was never normed for a person who is a minority. Beginnings of professional identity. So the Dictionary of Occupational Titles, also known as the DOT, was created in 1938, and it's actually a resource that we still use to this day. We don't use as much as we used to, but I remember when I was in school like 10 years ago, we were still using it quite a bit. And I actually still use it as a backup or as a second source to what we really use now, which is ONET. Okay, basic resource to match people with professionals for which they were theoretically well suited. For example, the Soviet Union Sputnik, which is like, something in space, a technology basically, caused America to focus on matching scientific and mathematical talent to compete. So what that means is Russia, Soviet Union, before it was called the USSR, created some space device, satellite, whatever you want to call it, and America got really jealous, and we're like, oh yeah? Well, we're gonna get smart like you are too and create something even better. And so that's something that you can see just because politically we wanted to be better than someone else, that encouraged people in America to start studying more about science and math. The National Institute of Mental Illness, also known as NIMH, which still exists to this day, was founded after World War II and then the VA, Veterans Administration. And the goal was to train counseling psychologists for the public sector. So the NIMH and the VA basically said, we need people who are going to be able to help society when it comes to mental health and, getting better and stuff like that. There's also Carl Rogers and the continuation of the mental health movement. Individuals have the capacity to explore themselves and to make decisions without an authoritative judgment from a counselor. So what that is saying is when you meet a counselor, sometimes people feel like, oh, that doctor is really much more smarter than me. I need to respect him. I need to just follow him. I should never question him or her or whatever, ever because they are a person of authority. What Carl Rogers said is, no, we talk to them like they're equals with us. We show them respect and dignity, genuineness, and stuff like that because we are there to help them. They are the client, they are the main focus. Little need to make diagnosis of client problems. Do not provide information or direction, very non-directive counseling, and emphasize the importance of the relationship between the counselor and the client. So these are something I'm sure you've heard of when it comes to Carl Rogers. He invented a thing called person-centered counseling or client-centered counseling. And what that is that you are not the center as a doctor or the professional, the counselor, but the client is, okay? And you're there to help them because they're asking you for help, right? But you still let them decide what to do. Sometimes people just need to talk things out, right? And so he really believed that. He was not going to say, well, I think this is what you should do. Instead, he's going to say, what do you think you should do? Why do you think you should do that? And stuff like that. And then let them go, well, because I think if I did this, it would make this happen. I'm like, oh, okay, great, or whatever. So it's a lot more about just talking and being very non-directive, which I actually personally find very frustrating sometimes. And so person-centered therapy is very non-directive in that way. Okay, you let the client decide um, where to go, what the focus is. You're just there to kind of like, echo certain things or reflect feelings so that they understand how they're sounding when they talk about these things. And then from there, they'll make those decisions themselves. Federal legislation and its influence on the counseling profession. So take a quick break and then read through the timeline on page 13 to 20 in the newest book or the most recent edition. Skimming it is good just so that you can get a sense of the timeline. So right now, I would love it if you just stopped and looked at the timeline that is provided in the book so you can sort of see the history of psychology. Feel free to take a break and then we'll just go on to the next and just press play again. All right, now continuing development of professional identity. The history of the American Counseling Association, also known as the ACA, has a mission, and it is to enhance the quality of life in society by promoting the development of professional counselors, advancing the counseling profession, and using the profession and practice of counseling to promote respect for human dignity and diversity. And I've actually hyperlinked that site so that you can look at it if you want to. You don't have to necessarily go through and read everything, but just know that it's there. So let's break down what they just said really quickly. It said to enhance the quality of life in society, right? So we're improving the community. And how they do it is by the development of professional counselors. So to train counselors so they know what they're doing, right? If just someone off the street is going to do counseling on you, it's not necessarily going to go the right way, which is why we want you to be educated. We want you guys to read and think and talk about this stuff so you fully understand what's going on. There's also advancing the counseling profession, which means make the counseling profession even better than it is today, right? And how you can do that is by, again, teaching and talking and learning, but also to do research, because research will help us understand the changes that are going on in a specific generation or a new discovery or something like that. And then there's also the using the profession and practice of counseling to promote respect. So again, to also say, this is about humanity. This is about us being good human beings, right? And so for us to continue that. All right, review the decisions and timelines on page 21 to 23. Again, it's kind of like a timeline as well, but it kind of tells you a little bit more about more specific things about identity, whether it is about licensure, education, and stuff like that. Credentialing and the professionalization of counseling. When an occupation has evolved to the status of a profession, that means like a lot of people are now in this group and we see them as kind of like, a legit group of people. That's partially because of a specialized body of knowledge and theory-driven research, which means that there's things that people have done to prove that this is actually an important area. The establishment of a professional society or association, which basically means, you start to form groups to promote this and think about, what is wrong, what is right about this, and how can we improve. Control of training programs. So now we're inside educational systems like school, like you're going to this department because you are believing in counseling or psychology. A code of ethics to guide professional behavior. So now there's rules on how a professional in this field should behave and how they should make these decisions. And of course, standards for admitting and policing practitioner, which means that once you're done with your education, you take a test to show us that you understand what you're doing. So that means that we are going to give you a certificate that says, yes, you are qualified to help other people through a counseling profession. Credentialing is the establishment of a professional training standards and regulations for practice. So credentialing is part of that whole let's make sure that you're really legit, by taking a test or doing something to prove that you are now aware and fully knowledgeable of what's going on. And that's in academic programs, national board certifications, and then also state licensure. And we'll explore all those as we go through this chapter. Accreditation is one way to provide accountability. What that basically means is it's one way to show people that you are responsible or an organization is responsible, to hold them accountable for that. External quality review used by higher education to scrutinize colleges, universities, and educational programs for quality assurance and quality improvement. And this is carried out by private nonprofit organizations. Accredited status as a mean of demonstrating their academic quality to students and the public. And of course, eligible for federal funds. So let's just break that down really quickly. So if you are in the rehab services program right now, one thing that you should know is that we didn't just go, hey, let's create this program and then that's it. No, we created this program, we developed all the curriculum, like all the areas that we know need to be addressed to become a good rehab services graduate, right? And there's actually people who come into our schools and then they observe, they interview people, students, former students, professionals in the field, people that work with schools. Let's say if they have a relationship with internship, they interview the teachers and everything. And they also look at all the syllabi and also the books and all that stuff just to see, are you really teaching everything that you say you are, right? Are the students saying that they're happy with the program? And so there are actually organizations that come in, they do that. There's a meeting, they talk about what needs to be improved, what you've done that's fantastic, and stuff like that. And then from there, then they say, okay, we approve you as an accredited school, okay? And believe it or not, we do go through that, and it goes on pretty regularly, not necessarily every year or every other year, but regularly enough, okay? And that's just so that we can then feel comfortable with the students that graduate. The students should also feel like, oh yeah, we did, learn what we were supposed to learn. If you did everything you're supposed to do as a good student, which is study and talk about it, do your internship and all that stuff. If you've been complaining the entire time or you don't read, or whatever, and you're, let's say, kind of like coasting through, and you're unhappy with your educational system, then that's really unfair, right? Because we had given you all the tools, you just chose not to take it, right? So that's a different area that we won't discuss right now. All right. Counseling on rehabilitation education is one of these things that we were talking about before. Accredited 92 graduate programs in rehab counseling, and you can look at that website. I hyperlinked it so you can read more up on them. Supervised practicum and internship experiences is also another area that they look at. But here are the 10 areas of study that they really do examine when they come and visit a school. Number one is the professional identity and ethical behaviors. Two is psychosocial aspects of disability and cultural diversity. Three, human growth and development. Four, employment and career development. Five, counseling approaches and principles. Six, group work and family dynamics. Seven, assessment. Eight, research and program evaluation. Nine is medical, functional, environmental aspects of disability. And 10, rehabilitation services, case management, and related services. So as you can see here, they're talking about graduate programs. So that's like the master's program. However, with the undergraduate, a lot of times people also model it after as well. So if you think about it, as you go through your your undergraduate program, you'll notice that you take classes in all of these 10 sections. Okay, and the reason why is because we're trying to prep you so that if you do decide to go to the master's program, that you already know some of that stuff, but you might learn more specific research-based educational materials than you were in undergrad, which is where we're introducing you to these ideas and topics. Council for Accreditation of Counseling and Related Educational Programs, also known as CACREP, CACREP. So they have accredited 601 programs, doctoral level programs included as well. And these are the areas where they actually look into it as well. They deal with people who are into addictions counseling, career counseling, clinical mental health counseling, marriage and family, counseling therapy, school counseling, student affairs, and college counseling. Supervised practica and internship requirements are also required for this program. If you want them to approve it, you have to have that part as well. Here are the 8 areas that they focus on when it comes to the educational aspect. Number 1 is professional orientation and ethical practice. 2, social and cultural diversity. 3, human growth and development. 4, career development. 5, helping relationships. 6 is group work. 7 is assessment, and then 8 is research and program evaluation. So again, you can sort of see these are a little bit more even specific, right? So when it goes into the graduate program and then also the doctoral program, PhD, we really want to know that you address all these things and that the students know all the stuff before they leave. Certification, the process of becoming qualified to practice in public schools or maybe another location actually. State laws pass in the same ways as licensure laws and recognition bestowed on individuals by the professional peers. So here's something you should know. Some certificates only work in some states. Some are national. Okay, that means all over the entire country. If you have it, you're good. Okay, but for some, you need to do the test or let's say go through the whole process state by state. So if you're Texas and you have all that stuff and you move to California, you might actually have to start all that stuff over again and do internship and all that stuff. You might qualify for some things that you don't have to do again, but overall you would still have to do other things because they do not pass from state to state. Recognition of competence by a professional group or government unit and allows the use of certain titles. So when you guys get the certification, it could be something like an LPC, which is a licensed professional counselor, or a CRC, which is a certified rehab counselor. Okay, does not confer authority to the holder to practice a profession. So just because you have it doesn't mean that you automatically become something. You still have to work at it and try to open up your own business or go into a place and then interview for the job and get it. You can't just say, I have this, now I can do it, right? You need to still have the business aspect of it working. But it also does not restrict others who are not certified from practicing a profession. I'll give you an example because it sounds like it could be confusing, right? Let's say, have you ever heard of a life coach? A life coach is actually someone who doesn't even have to have any type of education because a life coach is kind of like a cheerleader and that's it, right? And so there is actually no certification, no schooling that will teach you to become a life coach, okay? So I want this for you to know so that you can understand that people will do counseling even when they don't, and it can be kind of an iffy thing. However, if it's done in a specific way where you can get through these loopholes, these exceptions, then you actually still could do it. And then there are also places where people are so desperate to have professionally trained people that they won't necessarily take they will take you even if you don't necessarily have all their certifications. The National Board Certification. First, counseling-related national certification address rehabilitation counseling is the Commission on Rehabilitation Counselor Certification, also known as the CRCC, which is done by the CRC. Okay, there are 16,600 rehab counselors that were designated CRCs by 2012, and you're actually speaking to one of those people. If you're interested, after you graduate from your master's is when you can then take the CRC exam. And our program, as well as many other programs, do train you while you're taking your classes so that by the time you graduate, you are ready to take that assessment and hopefully you'll pass and then become a CRC. It's also known as the National Board of Certified Counselors, or the NBCC. Licensure. A credential granted or sanctioned by governmental bodies such as the state legislature that regulates either the title, practice, or both of an occupational group. So let's see what that means. So the state enacts licensure laws as a means to protect the public from incompetent practitioners. So what that is saying is that the state does these licensure laws because they want to make sure that people who are not qualified cannot open up their own business and do practice counseling. Okay, here I'll give you another example. A doctor that never went to school, but they said that they're a doctor, and they work out of their homes or their garage, you're going to be a little iffy about that, right? Because what is going on? Like, obviously, it's not truthful and it's not really necessarily healthy for a person, right? If you go to that person, there's a high risk that you can actually get hurt. So we want to make sure that the state is aware of these things and say, this is how we allow a person to work in this state, okay, as a counselor, okay? Becoming necessary to be recognized and reimbursed by insurance companies and governments and mental health programs that are private or public. So what we're talking about here is, okay, so for these people to be able to open their own business, let's say in the state of California, they need to meet all these requirements. And then from there, then insurance companies or whatever can then start billing them and know that they're actually getting quality care from this organization or whatever it is that you opened up. Title and Practice Acts, there's Licensed Professional Counselor, like I said before, LPC. LPC, I will tell you this, is actually quite new in California. I think we're the last state in all of it, the country, to have an LPC. Actually, when I went to school, for my master's, we didn't have an LPC, so we were not trained to study for the LPC. So if I wanted to take it, I needed, or take the LPC and get the licensure, I actually have to take a bunch of classes that were not offered before and then become an LPC. LPC is usually for someone who wants to open up their own businesses or, let's say, be a supervisor of some sort. So not everyone wants to do that. Some people just want to be a caseworker or whatever, or a teacher or someone who works in probation, so they actually don't need an LPC. Not everyone needs an LPC, okay? And note, counselors may practice without licensure as well. Okay. Again, it's something that will help you. Let's say that if there is two of me and I applied for a job, one without the LPC and one with an LPC, they would most likely hire the person with the LPC because it shows that they went further into their internship hours, because I think it's a couple of thousand hours, plus they took a test. So that means that they're pretty qualified. Okay. All right, current issues and trends in counseling. So here's a list of stuff, and then we'll also talk about that as we go along. Some of them we've already talked about as well. Professional identity, licensure, recognition and reimbursement of professional counselors, private and governmentally based, multicultural counseling, social justice, and then technology. So let's talk about professional identity. The ACA remains the strongest organization representing counselors. Requirement to be a member or divisions of, should it be optional? Are people counselors first and then specialists second, or the other way around? People's finances will affect the ability to pay to be part of these various organizations as well. So let's break this down so you understand what's going on. So the ASA is a really big organization. It's most trusted in this field, right? So are you now required to be part of it just so that you can do what you do, or can you be properly trained and not necessarily be associated with them? Right? That's something that they're asking. And also, there's also subdivisions. So do you choose one and then go into also another membership or not? Does it matter? And like many organizations, it actually can be very expensive. Okay, I know that there are a couple of them that once you become a professional, cost several $100s a year to be a member. And then if you're a sub-member in a very specific group, let's say rehab or disabilities or multiculturalism, you have to pay for another membership fee. So for that, you have to make a certain amount of money to be able to do that, right? You can't just spend several $100s on this if you don't have the money. So they have been kind of arguing back and forth about, do they just need a general membership or do they need to be much more specific? Are they actually getting what they say they want to get out of it, and stuff like that. So, or is the organization really providing anything, or is it just a name? So that's something that definitely people have been talking about more and more, especially now with the economic depression that happened in 2008, and then now again with this pandemic, can people spend all this money on stuff that is just more of a name, an association with? Okay. Diverse clientele providing services from healthy adaptations to pathology, and then seeking self-exploration to hospitalization. So having an understanding about being multicultural is really important because sometimes why a person is not happy is probably because of their culture and not necessarily anything else that's going on. So for them to then fully be able to talk about their culture and understand where they're coming from, maybe they're actually not depressed. Okay, or whatever it is that they are coming in for that we perceive that they have or society perceives that they have. Here's an example. For some cultures, they don't talk a lot. So someone in a westernized culture might go, oh, this person is antisocial. And there is a label for antisocial behavior. But when we learn that, then we understand really that this pathology that we think it is, pathology basically means kind of like an illness or a sickness, is really not real, okay, in that sense, in this situation. Okay. All right. Incarceration is another area that's really popular to talk about. 2.1 million individuals are incarcerated in the US. 16.9% have mental illness in a study, and in another study is closer to 50% of the incarcerated population has mental health problems. So people are going to jail or prison because of their mental illness. Is that fair? Should we not address those things so that they don't have to be in jail? Because if you think about going to prison and serving time, it's not that great. Okay, I know that some television shows make it look fabulous or fun, but it really isn't. If you've ever talked to someone who's been formerly incarcerated, most of them will say it was a bad time, it was a dark time in their lives. Okay, so we want people to not have to go through that anymore. And I know that during 2020, the year that we're talking about all of this right now, they're talking about defunding the police and then maybe funding more social services programs, and that actually might be a very good way to approach all of this. Okay, see jails as an alternative to mental health facilities for homeless substance abuse disorders. So are people going there because of other reasons as well? Back in the olden days, we used to put all the people with disabilities into an institution, right? We don't do that anymore. But is this almost kind of like an equivalent to that? Counselors also need to focus on families of people who are incarcerated. And again, that's something that's also really important is that children of parents who are formerly incarcerated, some of them will be affected by it. They might actually repeat what their parents have done or have mental health issues because of it. So that's an area that we definitely need to focus on. And if we want to break this cycle, then we definitely do need to address the families as well. Veterans. Issue regarding counselors being adequately prepared to provide services to veterans. Post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, and other health effects are really popular. But I will tell you this, not all veterans that you meet who, let's say, are sad or not sad have PTSD, okay? It is a common thing, but it does not mean that everyone that you meet who's a vet will have it. And that's something that I need you guys to understand because I've seen students go to every vet they know, do you have PTSD? Do you have PTSD? Inappropriate question to ask first off, okay? And as a helping person, you will need to get to know them to really understand whether or not they may have it or not, okay? 1 in 8 soldiers who fought in the Iraq reported symptoms of PTSD. More than 1 in 3 soldiers who served in combat in Iraq, Afghanistan, and other locations sought help for mental health problems. So you can see right there that is only 33% of the people who have it actually search for help with it. And part of that is there's a stigma to it where basically they're like, I can't ask for help. That's not something because that's a sign of weakness, right? And that's associated with men usually as well, right? And also just people who are not familiar with, let's say, how to be emotional. And soldiers, veterans, are often taught not to be very emotional, right? Of course, you can disagree with me on that, but that is what I've also seen as well. Counselors also need to focus on families of veterans. Again, the same thing when we talk about people who are incarcerated. Family members of people who are vets are also people that need to be taken care of as well. We need to check in on them because they might be a spouse, a partner of the person who is going through a rough time. And they also then need to also seek help as well, just to check in to make sure that they're okay because it can be exhausting, it can be sad, it could be, many things for the family members that are around them, their children as well. Traumatic events, trauma as a result of crises created by people or nature. So things that are bad that happen to people, such as violent crimes, car accidents, domestic violence, terrorist attacks, school shootings, or natural disasters such as hurricanes, earthquakes, and tornadoes. People feel overwhelmed and unable to cope with either being directly or indirectly affected by these types of events. So let's just talk about one that's kind of a natural disaster, which is this pandemic, this COVID coronavirus pandemic, okay? We've all been isolated at home for several months now, and some of us start to exhibit signs of sadness, signs of unable to cope with what's going on, right? I'm sure some of you guys have seen it or experienced it yourself, and it's okay. It's a natural reaction to it, right? And so we need professionals in the field to also be able to help people who've experienced these types of traumatic events. PTSD years later due to lack of counseling. Again, PTSD doesn't mean that you need it immediately. It can actually happen a lot later, and suddenly it becomes much more of an issue. Some people are able to survive, because we are humans and we try to stay alive. So we might ignore it, we might push it to the side, but later on, if you push it to the side for too long, it will reemerge again. You need to experience in crisis intervention. So that's obviously an area that trained professionals will need to do is to go through things where it's more sudden, okay? We're talking about a violent crime, like someone getting robbed or held at gunpoint or something like that, which could be very, very sudden. And to be able to experience and counsel a person who is going through that is some type of training that we actually include. All right, older populations. So in 2010, 13% of the US population was 65 years and older. Some are still working after 65 due to the economic reasons. Again, we talked about the economic depression or recession of 2008, and then also now in 2020 because of this pandemic. Mental health and substance abuse problems is one way that people, or these are ways that people cope with this type of thing about aging, okay? So people can also go to clinical depression. They can commit suicide or attempt suicide, chronic illness and pain, experiencing significant losses such as, their friends and family dying around them, social isolation, less people will talk to them or hang out with them, and then losing a sense of meaning or purpose in life. You used to, let's say, be very, work all day long and now you're retired and you're by yourself. Suddenly you don't feel like there's a reason to live anymore. And these are areas of counseling that are going to be a huge need because there's a lot more people who are living longer, who are older, and will need counseling as well. Addictions. 23 million Americans aged 12 and older require treatment for substance-related problems. 23 million people, you guys. So, and Americans anyways. So that's a lot. Large number of people do not have access to services due to a lack of adequately trained mental health professionals. So one thing that you do know is that, or you should know, is that there's not necessarily a lot of training that you need to have to be able to work in the field. However, it's starting to change. So that's why we want professionals who are educated and understand this field to go out and help. Because if you are a professional and you understand what's going on, you're just going to be a better helper, okay? A better counselor to a person than a person who is guessing or whatever. That could help. But if you're trained, fully trained, and recognize that you are fully trained through a licensure or accreditation or whatever, there's more likely that you're going to be even more effective and more helpful. There's a process addiction as well, which is gambling, internet, and sexual. So it's not always about drugs, right? It's also about behavior, process addiction, such as gambling, which is actually very prevalent in the Asian community. And then internet, which is something that's newer. Certain countries actually have high internet addictions like South Korea. And then, of course, sexual addiction as well, which you've probably heard about through some celebrities and stuff like that. Serving individuals who are gay, lesbian, bisexual, or transgender, also known as the LGBT population. However, because we are in 2020, I'm going to add 3 more letters to this alphabet, which is LGBTQIA. Q stands for queer, I stands for intersex, and A stands for asexual. Okay, 4 to 18% of the population is identified as LGBTQIA. So this class that we have right now, there are 50 students in this class, a little bit over that, but let's say 50. 10% of 50 is 5. So 5 of us in this class will identify as LGBT. Well, you students anyways, will identify as LGBTQIA. And remember when we first met in the class, could you really tell who is part of this population? Probably not. I know some of you guys think that your gaydar is fantastic, but really, many people actually live very successful, happy lives, and you would never know. Okay? And it's not an easy construct to measure because it is often invisible. Experience bullying and discrimination at school and workplaces. Just think back to your younger years when you were in, let's say, elementary school, high school, and stuff like that. Did you see, or were you one of those people that made fun of a person who was gay or lesbian or bi or trans or whatever it is, QIA? It's very common, right? So it's definitely something that needs to be addressed. There's a high percentage of suicide and homelessness through LGBTQIA children. And part of that is because their families disown them or they don't feel safe. Okay. 15 to 43% of experience discrimination in the workplace. They're being fired, denied employment, verbally or physically abused. So until 2020, there was no law in some states that protected you from being fired because you were gay. What does that mean? That means your boss could fire you if they think you are gay, lesbian, bi, trans, whatever it is. Okay, California, we live in California, so we're a little bit luckier. They're a little bit more progressive and there's protections, but not all states do that. And a lot of people who are LGBTQIA will actually decide whether or not they want to move to these states because, hey, if I get fired, I have to find work somewhere else, okay? Or they don't recognize marriage or whatever, which is also something that has changed recently, which is fantastic. All right. 15 to 57% of people who are trans report workplace discrimination. So that means people who are transgender or non-binary are often not able to find work because of discrimination of who they are. Imagine not being able to find a job just because of who you are, okay? This is over half. So when you see trans or non-binary people engage in sex work or drug dealing or whatever, you can't look down on them. They're trying to survive. They're just trying to put food on the table, pay rent and buy things that they need or want, okay? And over half of them actually cannot get a job because of who they are. All right, 9 out of 10 high school students who are LGBTQIA report harassment. So like we talked about before, were you one of those people who were bullying an LGBTQIA person when you were younger because you didn't really know? Or did you witness it? Okay, it is actually quite high. 60% feel unsafe in school, 72% were called derogatory names, and 18.8% were physically assaulted. If you want to find more information, feel free to go to this link that I put on there, but there's also other places that you can also find, which is like the local LGBT center, or just Googling, and you can find a lot of resources now, such as the Trevor Project and so forth and so on. Multicultural counseling and social justice issues. Reflect the diversity seen in today's society. Because we are living in America, we are a very diverse country, probably one of the most diverse countries there are, which is why we actually have a lot more race issues. And I'm really glad that we're now all addressing it all with you guys as millennials and Gen Zers who are bringing all these things out into the open and talking about it. All right, I'm not saying that other countries don't do it, but our country is especially quite diverse. All right, there's also diversity in age, race, ethnicity, gender, and sexual orientation. Understand how traditionally taught theories are applied to a diverse clientele. So a lot of the theories that you learn in, let's say, counseling theories, counseling 4500, are actually based on rich white men. Okay, those are the ones who created a lot of these theories that we're using. But it's up to us to now modernize it and say, hey, how do we approach, let's say, an Asian American population, a Latinx population, or an African American population, a Native American or Alaskan Native population with this theory? Can it work? Most likely it will, but we need to be sensitive about how there are going to be some things that need to be changed because of the culture that it's also associated with when you are doing counseling. Recognize diversity and embrace a cross-cultural approach in support with the worth, dignity, potential, and uniqueness of people within their social and cultural context. So what that is also saying is, when you do counseling, is that you also need to respect that person for who they are, whether it's where they're from, what their sexual orientation is, what their ethnicity is, what their age is, and what their sexual orientation and gender identity are. And that's it for this chapter.